Hello and welcome to Face to Face, our current affairs show where we explore the world's most pressing issues from a Central Eastern European perspective. I'm Anna Kalczyńska and joining me tonight is Adam Jasser, Deputy Director for News. Hello, Adam.
Hello.
Good to have you. As Eastern democracies struggle to sustain their pro-Ukrainian stance and try to resist Russian propaganda and influence in politics, a commission investigating Russian influence on Poland's internal affairs has concluded that the country's effort to counter disinformation have been inadequate. So how can we fight Russian propaganda?
Well, that's a question that the Commission should be answering, really. It was interesting that it was short on detail, this report, but it identified certainly that, there are certain narratives that are present in the Polish public debate, if you will, that are amplified by Russian accounts on social media. And you won't be surprised to hear that, and no one is really going to be surprised to hear that these narratives are mostly about being anti-Ukraine, being skeptical of the West's ability to grow, to provide peace and stability. We've heard it. And it's always a bit of a chicken and egg discussion. These trends, I think, they have been present in societies, not just in Eastern Europe, but everywhere. And Russia propaganda is just amplifying these voices.
Absolutely.
And, at the end of the day, things haven't really changed for the past 20 years, I think. For Russia, the idea that Central and Eastern Europe could permanently escape from its sphere of influence is unacceptable. And Russia, and I remember this vividly from the time when Poland and other countries were joining the EU, Russia was focused back then on NATO expansion and the fact that these countries were joining NATO. And the Russians sort of ignored the fact that they were also joining the EU, which in fact, in many areas, was by far more significant, joining the EU. So now, in a sense, Russia is fighting a rearguard action to delegitimize Central Europe as viable members of the Western community, and they want to drive a wedge between, let's say, new Europe and old Europe. And I think, we see across the region that these Russian objectives, they're followed. This is a proper campaign.
They're quite successful.
Billions of euros are spent by the Russians to do that. The latest example was, of course, Romania, where the pro-Russian candidate was allegedly financed by Russia, and Russian-linked accounts made his campaign on social media. And I think the Commission in Poland is pointing to similar risks here.
Absolutely. But it's always a tricky question, right? This junction between media and government. And the report, as you mentioned, failed to present evidence and lacked specifics as to its conclusions.
Because in a sense, it's the democratic countries are very often at a disadvantage here because they're in principle in favor of free speech, diverse opinions, and there are people in Poland who, for example, believe Ukraine should not join the EU or should not join NATO. The trouble is that Russia is trying to amplify this,
exploit it, yeah.
Distorting the facts and seeping in sort of propaganda. So that is the problem. At the end of the day, it's up to the governments and to political parties of different hues, I think, in Poland, to be resistant to that and not to become willing or unwilling
supporter
conveyors of that propaganda.
Absolutely. This is the weakness of democracy, right? We should say.
Or a strength, depending how you look at it.
Absolutely. Nevertheless, the Commission recommended increased cooperation between public authorities and the media. Now, my question to you, Adam, as a specialist, as a person of media, as a journalist with long time experience, how should it be done? And wouldn't it have a negative impact on the autonomy, the independence of the media?
It's up to the media to be careful not to fall for Russian propaganda. And I think, as always, the safest play is to stick to facts, to stick to history, to not allow opinions substitute facts. So fact-checking is important, and as we hear, some social platforms are no longer going to do that in a systematic way. So there is scope for journalists and for the media to realistic to the facts and to remind about the facts. So, you know, if let's say Russian propaganda, for example, tries to portray Russia's aggression as a result of, let's say, NATO expansion and security threats to Russia, it is up to the media to recall exactly what had happened, and that it was a naked Russian aggression rather than anything else, and that Putin's goals from the beginning didn't really deal with security and dealt with much more with subjugating Ukraine and keeping it in the Russian sphere of influence.
Speaking about subjugating, Russia has always had two hammers it used against Central Eastern European countries. That is, first, propaganda, and second, its gas and energy supplies. So that brings us to the map of CEE governments failed to properly diversify its supplies, and now they are struggling to look for other possible supplies or to maintain the price level at the very same level prior to the EU sanctions. So what's the status of Russian allies here in the Central Eastern European region?
I think we have
Who can Putin count on?
I'm not so sure he can count on too many of those, because even if you look at Mr. Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who very often presents Russian viewpoint on, let's say, Ukraine, but also on energy cooperation and so on and so forth.
Like a spokesperson for Putin.
He's yes, very often acting as if he was a spokesperson for Putin. But there are limits to this. You know, Hungary also has memory of Russian influence and Russian direct control, and I don't think Mr. Orban wishes for that to return. He's just betting on Russia winning the war in Ukraine, and he wants to be part of the settlement as the sort of wise man, and he wants to reshape Europe according to his idea how it should look like. Slovakia is similarly trying to have cake and eat it. So Slovakia wants to be part of the EU. It certainly doesn't see itself as part of, let's say, the Russian sphere of influence. But, you know, getting cheap energy from Russia, having good relations with Moscow, they see it as some kind of insurance policy. So they are playing both sides. And as you rightly pointed out, it's not even a question of being allied to Russia as such, in a formal meaning of the word, but it's more like being sympathetic to the Russian viewpoint. And we see that in Serbia, we see it in some other countries in the region. What is important to note in all of this is that these are mostly small nations, and their sense of insecurity is huge. So they are perceiving this global change in the global order that is now almost a banal thing to say, that the global order is changing. Mm-hmm. And they're hedging their bets. Whether this is a good strategy or not, time will tell.
Because it remains to be seen whether Putin really considers them as very important ally, right? How much is he eager to sacrifice? But as we speak, Putin, the Slovakian delegation is in Moscow, right? And
yes, but I mean, it follows several weeks of a soap opera called, you know, Will Ukraine block gas transit to Slovakia? And what a disaster it was supposed to be, and then nothing happened really. There are alternative routes available to Slovakia. The threats to stop electricity deliveries to Ukraine as retaliation, they did not materialize. So now Mr. Fico and his allies in the Slovak government, who are increasingly unpopular at home as well, they can just do some theatrics. And this visit to Moscow, well, we'll see what it produces, but I wouldn't expect any miracles.
But that still breaks NATO's unity, right? Unfortunately.
Well, it's not about really NATO, and but you have a point that Slovakia is part of NATO, Hungary is part of NATO, but they're not acting as members of NATO at the moment.
I've heard an opinion that there are two CEEs right now.
I think it's fair to say, because we clearly see Poland and Czech Republic aligning much more with the Baltic states and with the Nordics, and you know. This is what many analysts are now saying, that because NATO is such a huge organization and because the EU is such a huge organization, and sometimes agreeing on things may take a long time, or agreement may be elusive anyway, we will be seeing more and more coalitions of the willing, where countries which think similarly, which have similar attitudes to issues, they will close ranks and take initiatives and move the EU and NATO forward. We have the meeting of foreign ministers of NATO countries in Finland this week. We'll see what specific steps these countries will agree on concerning, for example, policing of the Baltic Sea.
Let's switch topics. Despite and regardless of the fact that Poland is a signatory member of the International Criminal Court, the head of the Polish president's office confirmed having sent a letter concerning Benjamin Netanyahu's hypothetical visit to Poland. Now, my question is, what made Andrzej Duda urge for the possibility of unimpeded visit by Israeli Prime Minister to Auschwitz?
We would have to ask President Duda what was his motivation. We can only guess. Certainly it wasn't, let's say, a genuine concern that Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming to the ceremonies marking the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the German Nazi camp Auschwitz. Because we knew from diplomatic sources before, and I'm pretty sure President Duda was aware of that too, that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not coming to the anniversary, to the commemoration. So in a sense, this whole discussion was started for no apparent reason. I think it's probably mostly due to domestic political situation. I think President Duda wanted to put pressure on the government and was hoping to put the government in a difficult diplomatic position vis-à-vis the United States or Israel. But that, of course, ended quickly with the Polish Prime Minister coming out and saying, of course, we can't imagine Prime Minister Netanyahu being arrested in Poland, despite the arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court, when he comes to such an important event as the Auschwitz anniversary. So that, in a sense, closed the issue. Of course, you know, there's a lot of domestic criticism of the Prime Minister by human rights organizations, by some of the legal profession, but I think they're ignoring the fact that this was a purely political move domestically, and that the Prime Minister can offer this because he probably knows from diplomatic sources that Mr. Netanyahu isn't coming. So the subject is moot anyway.
All right. Małgorzata Paprocka, the head of Duda's office, confirmed that such a letter was sent. And she said, in the opinion of the president, there is one key issue, precisely because it is Auschwitz camp. Every person from Israel, every government representative of this country should have the opportunity to take part.
Yeah, but
in this
again, we should not take this literally. Netanyahu isn't coming.
Yes,
so
we know
it's
that.
just, you know, it was just stirring the pot domestically.
Exactly. All right, so the third topic, just before Donald Trump's inauguration and before he takes office as President of the United States, we are getting to know his associates more and more. Now, Mike Waltz has been a frequent presence in the media and has addressed, among other things, the Greenland issue. So what can we say about his stance on the matter?
Well, I think Mike Waltz, who is going to be the national security advisor to Donald Trump, he's not really a policymaker. We have to remember that this is unlike many other administrations, US administrations, or more some of the European governments. It's not that cabinet members or senior officials in an administration really do shape policies, help shape policies for the president or for the prime minister. Trump shapes his own policies, and his people are there to explain these policies and to negotiate on his behalf. But I don't think they can really persuade him to do things. I think he's got a very clear idea of what he wants. And when it comes to Greenland, Mike Waltz, in a sense, explained what Trump was doing, and in his words, you know, he repeated that no options is off the table. So in a sense, he didn't offer any softening of the message that we're prepared to use force to take Greenland. But he also stressed that there needs to be some diplomacy around it. And then he said, well, just look at it from a security point of view. Greenland is a huge island linking North America with Europe, with the Arctic. As the ice is melting, Sea routes are opening. And look at the protection we're providing to these sea routes from Greenland. He says it's non-existent. And it's true. So in a sense, Trump, in his usual way, he's just a little bit ahead of the curve, forcing issues that have been perhaps neglected for too long by the West. And he's forcing the West to rethink this new order, because the old order is gone. So Trump is, yes, he's disruptive, but it's not that Trump is ending the global order. The global order is gone anyway. So in one commentator, it caught my eye, one commentator, Adam Bolton from Sky News, used this phrase that if you can beat them, join them. So Trump sees that China and Russia are basically undermining, and a few other countries are undermining this global order. They basically don't want to play by the rules anymore. And he says, accept this reality. This old order is not coming back. And we in the West have been too slow to react. So we need to start playing the hard game. And it's a power game, obviously. It's, for Europeans, this is, this is anathema, because Europe has been built on rules, rules-based order. The EU was seen as this, how should I say, the bastion of the rules-based order for many, many years. And now the times have changed, and raw power matters more than rules. And Trump is, in a sense, trying to prod everyone to start thinking in these terms.
That is true, and nothing is as it used to be, right? Nothing is also as it seems, because the words of Donald Trump aren't exactly what he means, but he's making a point, right? Yes. So is this a new modus operandi, that Donald Trump is going to say something and then will come Mike Waltz, for instance, trying to explain?
The risk for Trump is delivery. Because if he's raising the stakes, and if he's promising a more muscular US policy, even you could argue a more imperial American policy, which would be relatively new, then he needs to deliver something, right? So hypothetically, if, let's say, 3-6 months from now, there's a serious negotiation with Denmark about fortifying Greenland, changing its international status and so on and so forth, then he delivers. But if nothing happens and there's just a lot of talking, and because Trump's abrasive and non-compromising approach, the Danish and the Europeans will say, sorry, but we're not interested in this. We're going to do it. By the way,
Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said she's very happy about US interest in Greenland. So here you go.
That's diplomacy, but it's also reaction to Trump. You know, let's take a look at Greenland. Greenland is an enormous island. There are about 50,000 people living on it. Basically, very little in terms of military installations. There are some US installations that are under a treaty which is in place for decades.
US base.
But, you know, in terms of protecting the sea routes, not much is happening. It used to be the seas around Greenland used to be patrolled by the Royal Navy, the UK Navy, but it's not done anymore. And if we see what's happening in the Baltic Sea and around Norway, where Russian or Russian-linked ships are testing the defenses, breaking underwater connections and cables, then, you know, this exposure of Greenland to hybrid war is apparent. So in a sense, if the only result of all this is that Trump mobilizes the Western Europeans to start thinking seriously about defense, that's beneficial to Europe.
After all, isn't it what we all hoped for? A US policeman engaged outside its internal policy?
I am not sure. I think the world has been very ambivalent about the US policeman. But again, look at another area, the spending on defense, right? When Trump in his first term was saying, we are not going to finance European defense anymore, you guys need to spend more, people were sort of reacting to it, yes, we should, but, you know, it will take time and we have other considerations. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, very few leaders in Europe questioned the need to spend more on defense. Yes. And now there is talk of increasing this target even to 5%, which again may be another negotiating tactic by Mr. Trump. Even the United States, I think, they don't spend 5% of GDP on defense.
Poland is close next year.
Poland is close, but Poland, GDP also matters. Poland's GDP is smaller. Germany's GDP is much, much bigger. So if Germany spent 2% of GDP on defense or 3% of GDP on defense, then the collective European security would significantly increase. So again, you know, Trump is putting this on the agenda for the next NATO summit, and maybe 5% is far out, but maybe leaders will agree on a 3%, which is what President Duda, for example, was saying already last year.
Adam, thank you very much for your comments. That will be our full stop here. But let's see what happens during those next few days. Interesting times ahead, indeed. And that was Face to Face. Thank you very much for watching. But please stay tuned to TVP World for more news and commentary.